illustrate that. Direct conceptual onomasiology, what would be the crucial concept there, is not, well, to a certain extent, it's also about profiles, but it's more about entrenchment or relative salience. And the easiest way to think about it is, let's do a thought experiment. If I show you the type of garment that we had earlier, right, so this thing, if I show you that, let's say there are some 30 people here, we do an experiment and I'm asking you, what is this? Then probably only 4 or 5 of you would say breeches, I imagine. Okay. And the rest would say trousers. So we have 30 instances of the thing, and of those 30 instances, only in, let's say, 5 cases, a term is used that is specific for the thing. So that is a way of calculating the entrenchment or the onomasiological salience of, that's it, the onomasiological salience of a concept. So you have breeches as a specific category name. In the numerator, in the denominator, it's the frequency of the category reference. 30 examples of the thing in question, because there are 30 of you, and then only 5 of you would say breeches, and the other would say. So that's a way of measuring conceptual salience. Direct onomasiological salience, let me put it that way. What it means is, but you understand that, there is only a very weak preference for identifying breeches as breeches. Okay. On the other hand, if I would show you a pair of jeans and I would ask you, what is this? Then all 30 of you would say, that's a pair of jeans. So the category jeans is much more conceptually salient than the category breeches. And once you have that measurement, you can again do a number of things with that. You can, for instance, ask the question, to what extent is that form of direct onomasiological salience culturally variable, for instance? There are various theoretical links here. There's a link with basic levels and other concepts, but I'm not going to go into that. I also want to mention that was a very relevant question that came up during the break. If you want to do this, it's relatively easy if you're dealing with concrete objects, but what if you're dealing with something abstract, with an abstract concept? The example was glory. It's much more difficult, it's true. That's also one of the reasons why in many cases you would automatically shift towards an indirect perspective. So let me now give you examples of the indirect conceptual onomasiology. And there, the notion that I will be using is that of conceptual onomasiological profile. So again, different construals distinguished by their relative frequency. I think I forgot to say something very important. In all of these things that I would like to introduce, methodology is quite important. Why? Well, we are trying to contribute to sociolinguistics, and of course sociolinguistics has a tradition of specifically Lebovian, in the sense of Lebov, sociolinguistics, that's brand of research, has a strong methodological tradition, a strong tradition of quantitative research. So it's an important question for the framework that I'm introducing. What types of quantification can we use? That's why I'm referring to formal onomasiological profiles as something quantitative, different synonyms distinguished by the relative frequency. conceptual onomasiological profiles, it's similar. Okay? So we want quantification. We want to deal with it. So a set of construals distinguished by the relative frequency. And the construals in this case, because it's indirect, could be different types of metaphors, metonymies, associations, rather than direct naming. What can you do with that? Well, we'll give you two examples. One example is a historical one. It's dealing with historical variation in Chinese. Now, some of you are probably familiar with Chinese, and they will know that naming in Chinese is very often takes the form of a binary form. Okay, so nominal concepts, if you wish, often consists of two characters. And specifically also, you can see that very often in those naming patterns, metonymies are used to refer to things. So what one of our PhD students did was to ask the question whether the type of metonymic naming that you get in the history of Chinese changes. I must say that the background here was not so much an interest in Chinese, but an interest in types of metonymy. That was the theoretical question. The target concept here was woman, and then different types of different subcategories, if you wish, of woman. So an example, a clear example of the type of naming that's involved is one of the names for the concept servant girl is what you would literally translate as green clothes. So the two concepts together, but there is overall a metonymical relationship with the concept servant girl. Why? Well, because the dress was codified. It's a conventional color. You know, colors play an important role in Chinese culture. You have a number of coded colors, if you wish. So green is for servants. Okay. So what Weiwei, the student, did was to take the corpus of historical Chinese, and Chinese has a very long textual history. That's very interesting, of course, if you want to do diachronic research. So she got 11 target concepts, 11 subtypes of woman, and in a total of some 17,000 metonymic terms. Perhaps I should say these were taken, or these were identified on the basis of existing dictionaries of metonymies in Chinese. There are such things. There are dictionaries of metonymical terms. So that was the starting point. Then the corpus was filtered on the basis of those dictionary items. And then the metonymical mappings were classified. Because, as you know, when you have metonymies, you have different subtypes of metonymy, like part for whole for part, etc., etc., etc. So, as I said, initially we were interested in the question, what is the relative productivity of the different metonymical subpatterns. And then for each of 7 chronological periods, we measured the relative frequencies of the patterns in those metonymical terms. And those relative frequencies would then obviously constitute a metonymic profile. And we then applied the same kind of lectometrical approach. Okay, I haven't illustrated it, that's what I will be doing in a moment, but same type of lectometrical approach that we use in formal onomasiology. And so so we have a look at the question, if you have 7 time periods, you can think of each of the time period as a language variety, a lect. How similar are they? They are similar if the relative frequencies of the competing terms are more or less the same. If there is a change in the relative frequency of the competing terms, then the naming pattern changes, and then they are further apart. Okay? So, to illustrate, let's take the concept beautiful woman. And so you have the different naming patterns in the different periods. We subjected that to multidimensional scaling analysis. So this is the, if you wish, the semantic space in which the different metonymies are situated. And then the evolution for the 7 periods is indicated by that red line. So I'm going to split up the cube here with the 3 dimensions, and that came out on top of the MPS analysis. So what you can see here is that there is indeed, now I must admit one thing, I forgot which is the oldest period. But in any case, there is a, I think this one was the oldest probably. So there is a move, so to make it quite clear, each of these dots represents the onomatopoeical profile in the naming of the concept beautiful woman in 7 periods of Chinese history. Okay? And the line indicates how that naming pattern evolves in the semantic space. So what we see is that there is movement. If the naming patterns remain the same, then you would see all the points in one cluster. Okay? But here there is movement. There is a clear shift. It's not just random.
So these are different names, right?
Not just different names. These are patterns of names. So for each point, we would say, I don't think I've illustrated that well. Let me see if I have it. Yeah. So you have to think of it in this. We have a number of categories like piece of clothing for person. So that's a metonymical type. Okay. I'm not giving you a complete overview of all the types we have. But each of those types appears with a certain frequency. Yeah. And notice also that it is usage-based, so we're using the corpus. It's not just type-based, it's token-based, obviously. So we know how often a specific name that fits into this category is used in a specific period. We also know how another name that fits another metonymical pattern is used in the same period. And then you can measure the frequency of that pattern, because we're interested in metonymy, right? You measure the frequency of the pattern, of the different patterns for each point in time. And then, for the next point in time, you measure whether you have the same relative frequency of the various metonymies. And then you will know if there is change or not. So there is change. But then, of course, you want to do a qualitative analysis. So, well, okay, here you have a number of examples. So the next step is then you do the qualitative analysis and you look at, to keep it simple, you can look at the question, what is the dominant metonymical pattern in the different stages? And what we notice then is, simplifying a lot, initially it's characteristic for person, where the metonymy refers to individual characteristics, natural characteristics. In the middle stage, it's clothing that is dominant, and that relates to this codification of what people were supposed to wear. In the final stage, it's something, well, the name is maybe, or the identification, the label for the metonymy is maybe not so instructive, but what we see is an increase of a type of, how shall we put it, peripheral element, like cosmetics, some types of jewelry, and so on, as the basis of metonymies. So overall, what you get in the evolution is a movement away from natural beauty, natural characteristics, because we're talking about beautiful women, right? Movement away from natural characteristics. I don't know, think in the first period, think of, well, probably that didn't occur, but think of blue eyes or something, okay? From that type of characteristic to then clothing as a form of codification, and then finally to the more, to hairstyles, for instance. That's also one of the metonymical sources that we find. So it's, in general, it's a movement away from natural movement to decorative and artificial beauty. And interestingly, that is something that had been noted earlier in a cultural history of China. Apparently this is an authoritative source for the cultural history of women in China. I have to believe that, I wouldn't know. But the statement is, the development of the Chinese female beauty historically went through a process from unaffected physical beauty to artificial decorative beauty. And that is exactly also what we find in the progression of the importance of the different metonymical patterns. Okay? Yeah?
Could you go back one slide, please? No, one more. I'm not sure whether I understand what each axis represents. So it's a relative distance, but...
Yes, okay. In this case, this is purely the result of quantitative analysis, statistical analysis that we performed with a technique known as multidimensional scaling. Okay, and so these are the dimensions in the multidimensional space. The difficulty is, of course, how to interpret them, and that is, in this case, it's well, there is a way of doing it, but I would have to give you much more material to arrive at let's say, intuitively acceptable definitions of the dimensions.
And we do have any illustrative examples of Chinese and translated into English, for example, for us when there is these metonymical patterns?
Yes, I do, but not in this talk. I could have included them, but and I don't know them by heart. I would have to ask them. But
I'm trying to think if we have something similar in Russian, if we have this perhaps metonymical patterns or something. So just to make it clear.
Yes, well, the basic example I had was this green clothes thing,
and this is similar to white colors or blue colors. This is just universal metonymy like
Yes.
this. So we can imagine and we can think about some parallel things, but
Yes.
with those examples it is not so clear.
With jewelry or hairstyle.
Yeah, but the hairstyle is already difficult because you had a number of specific hairstyles, so you would need names for specific hairstyles. So a metonymy, if you want to translate it to English, for instance, one example would, for instance, be ponytail. If you take ponytail as as the name for the person and not as the referent for the hairstyle as such, then that would be one of the expressions that was included in the analysis. So if you would have ponytail, of course, the difficulty is to have really binary expressions with two elements would be a bit more difficult for English. Of course, you do have more or less similar.
Constructions, just attributive constructions.
Yes.
They nicely correspond to these bisyllabic things.
Of course, if take football teams or related sports teams, where you refer to them as the red shirts, for instance, that's also a type of metonymy. Or, well, the one I gave earlier, blue eyes. It's that type of metonymical expression. But typically for Chinese, it's always with two elements.
Yeah.
And in English, if you would say something like, okay, it's not purely blondie. Okay, I have blonde, then that would also be a metonymy, but it would be just a single element. Except, of course, that you have a suffix like thing.
I think in Russian there is red. Is red for beautiful. Red, Krasnaya Plosha.
Yeah.
It's like a beautiful because they think it's healthy.
Yes.
It's red.
Okay, but that's okay. Maybe that's the background of the question. Also, the colors that you have in the Chinese examples, I mentioned that they were codified, but not in the metaphorically or experientially understandable sense in which you could see why red means healthy.
No, it was in the old time. Now it's
Yeah.
not more anymore red.
But the codes in China are really they're social codes. It's like yellow is the color that is reserved for the emperor. Red is the color for happiness, etc. So and also to some extent hairstyles. Yes.
No, I was just about to say that there was a question about metonymies in Russian, and I think we have at least one clear example, which is длинный чулок, a long stocking, and you can refer with this phrase to exactly is some type of women. So answering your question, длинный чулок I think would be a perfect match to some Chinese metonymies.
And there would be attributive.
No, синий as well, yeah, but they're both. I think maybe.
So in general, if in certain, I don't know which terminology you use for morphology, but in general you could think of them as exocentric compounds, where the head of the expression does not fit the actual referent.
And where did you take the examples? How did you collect?
Oh, that's the corpus.
From the corpus.
That's the corpus. It's a pretty huge corpus. It's basically I think I don't know if it's entirely exhaustive, but it's fairly complete for the historical text of Chinese.
Lots of policing is there, so it's very difficult to use it.
Yeah, but it's controlled for polysemy. So first, okay, that's a step I skipped, but of course the dictionaries give you a potential set of metonymical expressions, but then in the actual corpus you have to control for polysemy. And that was, at this point, that was still a manual
So
correction.
it's very strange now. They started with one pattern, yes, and then they shifted to another one.
Well, no, it's
And
never
the
just
idea
one.
was
It's
before.
never just one pattern. You have different patterns in the
Yeah, I
different
mean,
periods, but the frequency of the
But
patterns is different.
combinations are different. So the
Yeah.
pattern is the same, two bisyllabic
Oh, pattern in that sense. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in that sense, but the fillers,
Yes.
I should say, they change,
change.
and they are conventionalized just in
But by the way,
on different stages
yeah.
of the language.
Yeah. But there were also a number, not dominant, but there were a number of just single character metonymies as well.
Mhm.
We also had those. I was focusing on this one because that's what you mostly get with two elements. But some of them are single character metonymies.
Does it mean that the former disappear, just they are thrown away and they don't matter just on the next during the next, or there is a sort of competition between the
Well,
first and
there is definitely competition.
in
Or replacement, if you gradual replacement.
and then replacement, and then
Yeah.
so how could we reflect it in our schemers here? Yeah.
Well,
Now,
this
there is
is
a
also,
competition and then a replacement and
Yes.
then
this is a simplified representation because what you have here is the reduction of the entire semantic space to 3 dimensions, okay? And it's a statistical reduction. What you could also do is to have a look at each of the profiles and the relative frequency of the profiles, and then at each of the stages and interpret it qualitatively. That's the next step that gave us this conclusion. So the quantitative representation here is, let's say, the first step because we want to get an idea of what is going on. In this, and the interesting thing is, in this case, you can really see the movement. You can see a movement in the semantic space. In some cases, it's more like an oscillation. It moves back and forth, but there is no general tendency. And that was one of the outcomes of the study that, okay, I'm not illustrating that, but ultimately the question was what are the different types of change that we have? And so in some cases it was, let's say, stationary, in some cases it's a more radical change like here, in some cases it's even going in one direction and then coming back to the original position. So that's one of the things you can do with this type of statistical processing. But if you want to understand what's going on, you would still have to look at the actual patterns and try to interpret them qualitatively.
and when
So,
Yeah.
no.
the concept of fashion or sort of theory of fashion involved in explaining
not for this,
Yeah.
not for this
the
period.
change in
actually.
status.
Yeah. That could play a role, but this is a history of 3,000 years.
No, I mean the theory of fashion in a large meaning, in a more generic meaning.
Yeah. Of course, cultural changes. Let's call them cultural changes.
Linguistic fashion, for example. I don't know.
I don't think. Well, in
Why some words erupt into our daily lexicons and sort of suppress all the others.
what would play a role? Don't forget that you're dealing here with a culture without the internet.
Doesn't really matter, I guess. It's not a matter of speed.
Well, it's a matter of speed. Not necessarily. Well, okay, unless you use fashion in a very broad concept, in a very broad sense, that is different from what we call fashion now.
I don't mean the theory of costume or beauty. I mean,
Preference for words, fashion for words.
Sort of.
It's a kind of thing that plays a role, and that is well established in the renewal of taboo terms, for instance. That's something that it's an interesting. It's a good question because it brings me to the next example, which is not about fashion, but which is about evaluative terms.
Yeah. And my question was about, well, I don't know this combination, but I looked it up, and there was a phrase "kid glove," that is Belaruchka. Yeah. And the question was, my question was whether how could they disappear, these patterns or these fillers? Yeah. They perhaps, well, to my mind, they should go in a certain direction, and well, perhaps acquire some pejorative meaning or whatever. So again, my point is that this is very, very suspicious. The simplified. You put it rightly. It is simplified because the real life of those patterns and those semantic meanings, is much more complicated. They should be alive in the language. They can't die immediately, but coming out of this picture, of the historic picture, perhaps they get some other additional meanings, and they belong to some other.
But I think that I think it might be useful in this case to see the distinction between what I refer to as formal and perceptual onomasiology. If you have formal competition between roughly the same referent without specific differences of construal, of highlighting certain elements, then, for instance, linguistic fashion would in fact play a bigger role. Bigger, not necessarily big. And maybe, although I'm not so certain if that is such an important factor, abundant polysemy could play a role. A term might become so polysemous that people start avoiding it. That is definitely the case, but with the conceptual changes, I think these are much more related, at least in this example, to cultural changes, and not just.
First, it was just up to the fashion to wear small, to have small hands, or to wear kids.
Yeah, but that amounts to the same thing. That amounts to the same thing. No, I don't really see the difference of perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, more about clothing. No? Okay, I'm now going to take another example. So the question here, so now I'm going to explain this mythological term. So one of the for contemporary data, the question would be what type of methods you can use to have a look at the time. Okay. What types of methods you can use to deal with the big data that we have, with all the abundance of information. And okay, as many of you will know, there is a lot of interest these days in computational analysis of lexical distributions, and lexical distributions as a way of identifying differences of meaning. So the question would be, in this case, whether we can use that to identify changes of indirect conceptual onomasiological construction. So let me perhaps not. Yeah, okay, but this is, I don't know how relevant this is. I tend to introduce use the method by making a distinction between two steps in the way you deal with corpora. There is so the basis is, of course, you are dealing with, you're taking a distributional approach. You assume that the context in which a word appears, context in the textual sense, that the context in which a word appears give you information on the meaning of the word. Okay, that's the distributional hypothesis. Once you have that hypothesis, there are two steps to take. First, you have to retrieve the relevant contexts. That's data retrieval. And you have to analyze them. You have to extract the information from them. And both steps, yeah.
And for this approach, when we treat context where lexeme appears as its mean, it's not a simplification for computational linguistics that is actually what we suppose. So the meaning is a set of contexts.
Yeah, okay. That's, we could discuss that, but I think maybe in linguistics, the question I think would be how much interpretation would still be involved. But I know computationally you can just define the meaning as the set of context. From a linguistic point of view, I have some reservations with regard to that, but that's maybe for a later discussion. Okay, and both steps can be taken manually or statistically, or computationally if you wish. And you can identify different traditions of distributional semantics in a very broad sense, if you see that distinction. So, if everything is done manually, then you have good old-fashioned lexicography. Because what you do as an old-fashioned lexicographer, you have all your texts with all the instances that you find of a certain word, and you look at the context in which they appear to get at a definition. So both steps are manual. When you do collocation analysis in the Anglo-Saxon John Sinclair type tradition, what you do is to retrieve the relevant contextual elements like collocations statistically, but the interpretation is mostly done manually. When you take what is now known as, I'm missing a few, no, that's an example. Okay. When you take a behavioral profile approach, which is basically also, I would say, the approach of the Moscow School of Semantics, then you manually identify relevant contexts, but these days extracting patterns on the basis of those would or might be done statistically. And then if you try to go statistically all the way, so to speak, then except for the element of interpretation that would come in, then you would get vector space approaches. So the question, and I'm going to skip that. So what we're trying to do in this methodological semantics project is to use vector space approaches in the context of formal and conceptual onomasiology. So for instance, for formal onomasiology, that would mean, and that's a standard thing in distributional modeling, well, it's not so standard because there's still a problem of listening, but it's a question of identifying synonymy relations that would form the input for calculating formal onomasiological profiles. But what I want to show here is the Struggle example. So what we do, among other things, is to identify dimensions of construal that are relevant for conceptual onomasiology. So I'll give you a semasiological example first, but most of you are probably familiar with, who is not familiar with vector space approaches? You all are. Okay. Then the example will not be so relevant, but let me give it anyway. So one thing we do is to go beyond the standard forms. We go to the token-based approaches and then try to identify the underlying dimensions that separate the different or structure the different tokens of items. So what you have here semasiologically is a diachronic visualization of the semantic field of, I can't see it entirely. You should be able to see more of this. So these are the words, right? All different evaluative words in English. And so we have the semantic space in which they occur. And what you can see at this point, so here, this is terrific. And you can, so these are words like lovely and delightful and fantastic. This is, if I'm correct, 1860, the situation in 1860. Yeah. And you can see that terrific is still not a central positive evaluative word. That is because terrific in those days still very much carries the meaning that we would now express as terrifying. So now terrific is like that, but the etymological meaning is of course scary. And here you can see that that is still the case. And what you would like to see with the vector space approaches is that it moves towards the rest of the that it moves towards the rest of the group. And so if we simulate that, not simulate, if we visualize that, if we take the different moments in time, then you can see that exactly from mid-19th century to late 20th century, you get this shift in meaning of terrific. Okay? So this is an interesting example of, and of course you have to admit, it's not always as readily interpretable as what you have here. So vector spaces do seem to be an interesting approach to get a handle on meaning. Yeah, so that's the same thing. Now what can we do with that? Another example here is detecting. So you'll see that I'm giving you different examples, and then I'm coming to my indirect conceptual example. So this was a semasiological illustration. Now a formal onomasiological illustration, there you want to identify lectally structured synonymy and polysemy. And the example here is the Dutch word monitor. To some extent it means monitor in the sense of computer screen. In another meaning, it means something like youth animator, supervisor. No, well, not really supervisor, but you know, when you have a group of kids and they need to be stimulated to do whatever and to be discouraged from doing other things. And in a playground, that kind of thing. That's also one of the meanings that we have for monitor, but only in Belgian Dutch. So the question there would be, if we use groups, not at the level of the type, but really for each separate instance of the words that we find. Can we then identify the observations that constitute, in terms of sociolinguistics, the envelope of variation for monitor scherm alternation? Because, okay, the computer screen reading alternates with the synonym term scherm. And there may be other synonyms, but keep it simple. Okay, and we can do that. This is the semantic analysis that we derive from the vector approach. And if we can identify the source of the text in which we can find the terms, then we can code them as either being B for Belgian Dutch or N Netherlandic Dutch. And what you can see then is that this area is only blue. Well, okay, there are a few incidental cases, but this is mainly blue, where here you have an overlap of blue and orange. So, this is probably the area where you find the computer screens. This is the area where you find the youth animators. So again, this is the promising example of a socially variable polysemy analysis in this case, or at the same time synonymy analysis based on the distribution method. And this of course is what we were thinking of when we introduced the term mythological semantics, because these are clouds of tokens, of observations